Hello, I'm Eleanor Gibson. I'm the US editor of architecture and design magazine, Dezeen. And I'm delighted today to be joined by architect Frida Escobedo. And we're going to have a chat, and then I'll open up for some audience questions at the end. Welcome. So firstly, I thought maybe you could tell me how you got started in architecture and like what your background is.
Well, thank you for having me and for having this conversation. I wasn't sure that I was going to be an architect from the start. Some people know right away when they finish high school that they want to do something in life. I wasn't sure. I was too young. I was 17 when I finished high school. So I knew I wanted to do something related with the arts or design. And my gut feeling was that architecture could give me a structure. So if I made a mistake and I wanted to change careers, it would give me like a way of thinking. And intuitively, I was right, because I think architecture is not just a craft, but it's also a way of understanding the world. And fortunately, I was hooked the first week, and I thought, like, this is great, this is what I want to do. But eventually, I finished school, and then I started working. And I grew up a little bit tired of what the profession was for me at that time, which was just building and, treating with clients specific things, but not experimenting or understanding social aspects and relationships that happen within space. So I started flirting with the idea of changing paths a little bit, and that's when I found this program at the GSD, Art Design in the Public Domain. So it was like going back and forth, always like thinking about, I wanted to do architecture, but I didn't want it to be hyper specialized. And we were just talking about this. I think disciplines should be a little bit more blurry and to contaminate in a positive way between each other. I think that's important.
So do you find that you take influences from a variety of disciplines when you're designing?
Yes, I do. And of course, we're influenced by other architects, which I admire and respect, and that's always a reference. But also we go to literary references or music or cinema or art. So I think there are things that can be explained through architecture, but there are some others that can only be explained through art, for example.
Can you tell me about your first project? What was the project that really started things for you?
Well, I never worked for another architecture office, for good and bad. So I started, like everyone starts when they're independent, like doing small renovations. So the first one was this renovation of an apartment for my partner's mother. She just wanted to do a small room, a small addition to her house, and we managed to convince her of doing a whole new apartment because we were, very eager, very hungry for doing things. But I think the first project that I feel like it's my own, that was like something that I would describe as my first project, was one that is called Casa Negra, or Black House. It's a very small studio outside Mexico City, and it was done for a friend of ours. He had very little money. He actually had to sell his car. We did it under $10,000 at the time. And it was the first experiment in trying to do something with very little resources, but trying to optimize what the social space for him were. So I think that's the first one.
And so you never worked for anyone else, which is very impressive. How did you go about establishing yourself and building the studio that you have today?
Well, I don't know. It happened like very organically. I always flirted with the idea of working for someone or going to do a master's degree. But I also was very stubborn. I wanted to do things my way. The only way to do it was to be very diverse. I had to be doing this small house, but at the same time looking for grants for doing like research projects, or maybe like doing installations. And one big opportunity was El Eco Pavilion. I think that was the first public project that I had to do, even though it was a very small one. It was the first experiment where I could really see how social interaction and behavior could be materialized in space, and that was super interesting to me. And that was like a lesson on how if you try to specialize yourself too much, then probably work for someone else. But if you want to stay independent, maybe you will need to broaden your spectrum to stay flexible and resilient.
And you're based in Mexico City, and can you tell me why you choose to base your studio there and what the benefits are of it?
Of staying in Mexico?
Yeah.
Well, it's a very vibrant and crazy city, and this is where I grew up, and I think we're defined by what we see and what we absorb. And I feel very lucky to be living in a city as complex as that, because there are a lot of challenges for sure. There are many urgent things that need to be done, but at the same time, we have a culture of just layering things and coming with solutions that come out of from having literal resources and optimizing these things. So it kind of makes you a little bit like to grow a thicker skin, but also like to be very, like spontaneous about the solutions that you come up with, and also to collaborate a lot. In Mexico City, we do a lot of collaborations between studios of different generations and different backgrounds. You would get together with a graphic designer, for example, to do one project, or with an industrial designer to develop something. And it happens the same with a studio that is probably more established. They would invite you because you have a younger perspective, and you would join with them because they have more resources and more experience. And I think that becomes like a very interesting environment to develop ideas. And it's, like you start to understand how to prioritize what's important for the project, and not just to show your ego or your personal voice. It's about what the project needs.
There's been a real boom in Mexican architecture, and definitely a lot of press attention and seeing what's going on there. I wonder why you think that is and what you think about that.
I think it's related to what I just mentioned. I think it's this idea of collaboration and of seeing things through different perspectives. It's not just like there's one solution. There are many, thousands of solutions. So it's about the conversation that we have between the collaborators or the group of people who are developing this project, whether it's done internally at the office. I never feel like it's just one voice. I feel like architecture is a collaborative discipline. And that kind of enriches the vision, no? Like it allows you to really understand things through other perspective. And also, like, we have a history of relating with materials in a very particular way. The tactility, the color, the texture is actually storytelling for us. So I think that's also really important. And it has been a tradition for so long that it's kind of in the DNA. You don't think about it. It naturally happens.
And how do you see yourself kind of fitting in the Mexican architecture scene? Do you think about that?
No, I don't. It's a good question, but I don't know. I've seen a few changes in the past years. I've seen, when I was studying architecture, maybe there was this moment where we wanted to be very global, so there was more of an international, whatever that is, language that we wanted to feel like we could belong to these generation of designers that were doing amazing things in Europe and in the US. So we kind of were imitating that a little bit, and slowly I think that changed. So we're looking back more at what we're doing locally. I don't know exactly why that happened, and I think there's also more collaborations, and smaller scale projects have become something important and recognized, and I think that's valuable because sometimes the smaller projects work as petri dishes, and they have less interest involved, and they allow you to be more experimental and think about other dynamics rather than larger buildings.
Recent years, since the Serpentine Pavilion, you've kind of become a really global figure in architecture. Is that something that was an ambition for you? And is it something that you want to kind of build on? Or are you just, what's your ambitions in your career?
I never imagined that I was going to get the Serpentine Pavilion. It was quite a surprise. It has been a really nice journey because you get the opportunity to design this amazing public space that is so visible for so many people, but at the same time, it kind of builds a layer of trust. So yes, of course, new projects have come into the office that before the Serpentine wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, it shows that smaller projects can really consider many other ideas than just space, no? Like how we understand relationships with each other, how we deal with our context, what does time and space mean, for example, like these abstract ideas. So I think it was just this moment where I realized that the practice should be as diverse as it had been. Maybe we're doing more ambitious projects now, but I still want to keep experimenting with the smaller scales and research and that layer.
Do you think of yourself as having an architectural style when you work?
I always think that I don't, but now that I'm seeing the images right here, there are common threads, no? And I'm scared about the idea of a style. And we're working right now on doing the first book of the office. We don't want it to be like a monography. It's more a research. And what we've been finding out is that the way we work at the studio is more like a constellation of things that connect to each other. And we're trying to find the things that repeat a lot, the interests and preoccupations that are constantly reappearing in all the projects. And I think that defines the spirit of the office rather than the style. So I think I like more the idea of a spirit rather than the style.
Because you work across kind of a wide scale of projects, from furniture, Aesop stores to houses. Your style, obviously your process, does it change for each of those, or do you approach them all in the same way when you're working across the variety of scales?
Well, of course it changes because they're very different from each other, but the thing that is a constant, I believe, is that we always want to ask questions with what we're doing. It's not like, oh, we want to do this because we like that color or that material, that proportion or that, It's what can we ask ourselves, or like in a more like a social or even like philosophical context with this project. So if it's not creating a challenge for us or asking a question, we try to stay away from it. So yes, in the case of social housing, is like what defines the idea of home? What is a family? How is it composed? How can we create opportunities for that kind of distinction? And the same happens with furniture. What kind of relationship we have with an object? Does it create a degree of intimacy with someone else? So it's always talking about space, but basically talking about social dynamics within space.
You mentioned then a social housing project, and you recently contributed to an experimental community project. Could you tell me a bit more about that project, what the brief was and what your response was?
Yes, we've been working with Infonavit, which is a financial institution in Mexico that gives credit to workers to buy their homes. It's the largest institution in Latin America. They give thousands of credits. And they had this program where they wanted to rethink what regional housing was, like what the context was for them. And of course, there's the context, the physical context of a house, but there's also the social context. So what we wanted to ask, what was the family composition, for example? Usually social housing is considered to be for a typical patriarchal, heterosexual family, mom, dad, maybe 2 kids or 3, and it's like a very closed-mind way of thinking because families are composed in so many different ways. And even nowadays, we need to think about more ways of how these families are composed. So the first challenge was to reconfigure that idea of the nuclear family and to think about more like an expanded family, because this is what happens a lot in Mexico, especially in social housing. Families get together and they share spaces, and that could be an opportunity to optimize resources and also to reduce the debt of families. So when they would buy a house, if you, for example, start joining certain units, you can have a shared wall, which means in the case of the example that we did, you had 4 physical walls. So if you get to build the other context, you would have to pay 25% less for each house that was added for the walls, and so on. So you were optimizing resources, you were creating opportunities that were financial, but also social, because you had these interior courtyards, which is an idea that happens a lot in Mexico. The courtyard and the vecindad. It's like these open space where people actually share the communal activities such as washing, cooking, the children playing. So we wanted to go back to that idea and say, like, okay, we're proposing an individual unit that needs to be modular and needs to be repeated for efficiency, but we can also create this idea of a social space that would allow for example, domestic labor to be reduced too, because in the scale where you can share cooking or childcare, that would reduce the hours of work for women. So there's so many layers to understand in social housing that are fascinating.
Social housing and low-cost housing seems to be kind of in vogue at the moment. I mean, a project won a Sterling Prize. There's loads of projects popping up in North America. I wonder why, if you have a reason why architects are now paying more attention to it, or why, they're getting involved, or maybe if you have any thoughts on that.
I think we're not thinking about it as much as it's needed. I think we're being behind and we're slow. I think this is an amazing opportunity, and we have the responsibility of finding the way to do it, because of course we will be invited to do commissions for private projects and for mid-income or higher income developments, but for social housing that's a challenge, and I think it's our job, our task to find a way to do it.
So you've done a lot of private residences, and you were telling me that you're working on one at the moment. What do you enjoy about those projects as an architect?
Well, I see architecture, as I was telling you, as a way of understanding the world. So it's really fascinating to get to that level of intimacy with someone, from not knowing them at all to knowing exactly how they live and how they want to live in the future. So it becomes like a very nice and sometimes challenging way of working, but it also teaches you what you can do from the private sphere and into the public. No, every time you do something in the domestic space, it will affect what you do on the public space. So there are interesting considerations, especially in places like Mexico City, where you, for example, you would have, and going back to this idea of domestic labor, you would have live-in domestic workers, and this is a question that we want to ask, no? Like, do we want to keep doing those dynamics? Do we want to have residual spaces that are only used once a year, like this idea of the living room, the fancy living room that no one touches? Or do you want to change that and become like a little bit more experimental in the way you're presenting these spaces so they're actually used, you don't create residue, you're building less, but people are living those spaces more? So that's interesting for me.
You mentioned a lot of kind of ways that you see architecture impacting not so the way we live, but making really like bigger changes in the society. What are the kind of issues that you're thinking about at the moment? So the social housing, the use of domestic workers. Are you thinking about that? Are there any big topics that you're thinking about?
Well, domestic labor is definitely a fascination and something that I'm very interested at right now. In Mexico, it was until this year that domestic labor was recognized as formal labor, especially paid domestic labor, which is unbelievable. No, like this represents 25% of the economy. Domestic labor, if you would pay for it, it would be a bigger part of the economy, larger than oil and tourism. So it's huge, and no one is thinking about it, and we're not thinking about what needs to be done in terms of just like the domestic structure, but also in terms of what public transportation services are needed if we recognize this as a formal job. So they just ratified the Convention 189 this year, and that allows workers to be able to join Social Security, and that will have a lot of implications. They will be able to join that, but that will impact, of course, how hospitals, childcare facilities, elder care facilities are going to be built in the future, and if we don't think about it, then a lot of of the female population is not going to be having the services that they require adequately. No? So I think that's a big challenge. But also residual spaces, like how we are as architects are producing more new spaces that quickly run out of fashion and become disposable. No? So I'm very interested in this idea of something that is evolving all the time. I don't think architecture should be static. It should be in constant movement and flow. But how can we do that and not create so much residue left behind and not create this idea of aspiration that allows to create so much waste?
This idea of waste and kind of making architecture more sustainable is on everyone's mind at the moment. People are thinking about it more and more. How do you approach that in your architecture?
It's really challenging and difficult. I don't have the right answer. This is something that I keep looking to do. But so far, for me, it's been about thinking about materials that age in a different way, that need low maintenance, that are flexible. The more the architecture becomes flexible and porous, not just like physically, but also like in the way that it operates, it allows it to transform. So there's this idea, again, of the architect being like the mastermind of this beautiful piece that never needs to change because it's so precious. And I think that's not the type of architecture I'm interested in. I'm interested more in how it keeps adding layers and becoming richer and richer.
The permanence of architecture means that it's very difficult to make a mistake. And I wonder if you ever look back at a project and think, that was wrong, or I wish I'd done that differently.
Yes, and actually it became very liberating when I understood that people are going to change things, like what I was thinking maybe was not the right answer. I'm not infallible, like I won't have the truth because there's not one truth. There are many ways of seeing things. And when I understood that, then it was like, well, then now I'm free because everything will evolve, it will change. So it's a good idea.
You're one of a number of very important and emerging female Mexican architects. There's yourself, Tatiana Bilbao, Fernanda Canales. I wonder why now this is happening. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I have to thank Tatiana for doing that, because before her, it was really rare to see a female-led studio. Like if you go back in Latin American history, it's probably only Lina Bobardi who was leading an office before the 90s. And it's only now that Lina's work is being recognized so much. In the past, it was just like this amazing but kind of obscure Brazilian architect. And there are many designers also, Clara Porcet, like so many others who were working in the modernist times doing amazing work, but it's only until now that they're slowly emerging, and I think that's going to change soon. I've seen like younger generations like being led by more like female figures, and I think it also has to do with this idea of interdisciplinary structures, where it's not the architect as designer, as like this vertical scheme of doing things. It's more about collaboration and being a little bit like more flexible and to flow more between things, that has allowed also to female expression in that sense.
I mean, it's not just in Mexico that female architects have, encountered barriers, but I was wondering if you had any difficulties in your career as a woman architect.
Not in my case. I won't say that things have been like super easy either. I think there's a lot of of things to do, especially in terms of salary parity, for example, and in terms of maternity. I've seen it in my office. I don't have kids myself, but I think there's something that we need to talk about, and because you see many female students joining architecture school is probably like a 70% ratio to 30 for male, and as you advance the school years, you would see it's 50-50, and then it turns the other way around, and by the time you get to like the professional years, you would see a lot of female architects again working on the base, but there's like a glass roof that we still need to break. And I think it's moving, and I'm glad that that is happening, but I think it's not happening fast enough.
The infrastructure needs to change kind of to allow that to happen. The architecture world has kind of based itself on this star-architect idea, and there are these star-architects who win a lot of the projects. Is that something that you see is going to continue? Is that set to change, do you think?
I think that's over.
We're done with it.
Yes.
So in terms of other architects, who do you admire in the work? Whose work do you look at?
Oh, wow, lots of people. I couldn't mention. I would probably leave a few out because I won't remember all of the names, but from Mexico, I admire quite a few. Mauricio Rocha, he was my mentor at this scholarship, Young Creators Grant from FONCA, Fondo Nacional de la Cultura y las Artes. And he was an incredible teacher to me because since I never worked for another office, I had this like this void of having a mentor. And the thing that he taught me was to be patient and to go slowly, which was like a funny, thing to recommend to a young people, to a young person who wants to open a space for himself or herself in the world. And also like good friends, no? Jose Rojas, he was a great influence. He was my classmate during my architecture years, but then he moved to art. And that kind of shift also influenced me, like the way he was seeing the world and the architecture was completely different from the perspective of the architect. And then, of course, Productora, Lance Atelier, they're good friends, and we do collaborations sometimes. And then from outside, I have also good friends, Leon Leon from New York, Camilo Restrepo from Colombia, and there's so many, on and on. Yeah, I think it's an interesting generation because people usually think that this type of collaborations just happen in Mexico, and I've seen that slowly it turns into a wider network, and they're very helpful, and we share resources even like outside borders, and I think that's something that's really important to do.
So the Serpentine Pavilion was a real turning point for you. You said that you weren't expecting to get it, but could you tell me a bit more about the project and the theory behind the design?
Sure. So we kind of freaked out when we found out that we were selected to do it. I never expected that. So we had a relatively short period of time to develop the idea. And while we were looking at the brief, there was these two lines that said, okay, well, the pavilion is a temporary structure that is going to be in Kensington Gardens for 4 months, and then the pavilion is sold each year either to a private institution or a private collector, and then it's moved somewhere else, and that could be installed in the future. We don't know where or when. And to me, that was quite a shift because it kind of broke the idea of what we're taught in architecture schools, that architecture is permanent and it's site-specific. So we had the challenge to develop a project that was site-specific but temporary, and then it was permanent but without any context. So that gave a way of thinking about how we really as humans understand space and time and relationships. And we are doing this all the time, no? Like the idea of having a watch and divided into 12 hours, or dividing the Earth in a grid for the Jeffersonian grid, for example, no, like a mile grid, or the meridians and the parallels, which was the one that really anchored the project. Because these imaginary and abstract ways of thinking about time and space really define our interconnections to each other, no? And it turns out that the Greenwich Meridian line is in London, so it made perfect sense for that to be the ground zero, so that when the pavilion would be moved, it would always have this echo of where it started, even when it's not located in its place of birth, let's say. And we also wanted to express what we do in the office, so we chose to use like very simple material, something that was not dependent on the detail or the material itself. It was more about the expression that it could give. So we decided to use these concrete roof tiles and to create like this porous idea of the celosía, which is a Mexican concept that allows for the landscape and the wind and the sun to come through. That comes actually from Spain and from the Arab world, where you have these degrees of intimacy where you can see but not be seen, and you kind of disappear and reappear. So we created this closed courtyard, as you can see, that's aligned to the Serpentine galleries. And then there's this line, this shift, that creates this division. And it's very lucky that I have these images right now, because this line is aligned to the true north. So in a way, when you walk to the pavilion, it becomes this kind of compass, or this kind of sundial, where you can actually see the sun moving through the pavilion, and it kind of locates you in the larger area of where the globe is and where you're located in the globe. And if it moves, it will still have that kind of effect to you, and you will realize that, of course, time is passing through, but it's the time that you spend with people within that collective space, and it's like about being very present and mindful of where you are.
Great. And recently you've been starting in education or working in education. I spoke with Bethan earlier about how there's been a lot of calls to reform architecture and design education. What is your take on that?
What should be...
Whether the way that architecture is taught in schools is the right way, or if there needs to be a change.
Well, the most recent studio that I was teaching was at the GSD in Harvard, and I've seen like a very interesting shift. By coincidence, I was teaching the previous semester in spring at Rice University, and Sarah Whiting was the dean there. And we didn't know this, but I was invited to the GSD before she was invited to become dean. So it looks like I've been following her, which I am in a way, but not so creepily. And I think she has a very fresh perspective, and also Mark Lee from the GSD, he wanted to do something that was a little bit more open-ended. And when I proposed doing a study about domestic labor, and I mentioned like this is probably going to be a very like challenging studio because there's very little information about it, and it's not going to be just design centered, but also research centered, and there's going to be a lot of speculation in that. But I think that's a design opportunity. He was very open to that. So and when I saw the other presentations of the studios, it was more about what we can do with what we have and how we can start thinking about climate change and resilience and social dynamics and building less and doing more. And I think that's very important right now. It was not about just design and new materials and new shapes and being more experimental and more innovative. It was probably being more measured in what you're doing, but actually creating like some big opportunities for designers.
In terms of the work culture of architecture, which is often embedded in architecture schools, the long hours, overnighters, was that your experience studying and working? And is that something that should change?
Yes. Yeah, I spent long hours, and when you're young, I mean, you kind of think that you can do it all. So I remember like doing 2 or 3 nights on a row with like working nonstop, and at the end of the day, you're a zombie. Like you're not even thinking straight, and I think that should change, and that has to do with being able to collaborate again, no? Because when you're like thinking on a project on your own, of course, you're going to be spending 13, 14, 24 hours just doing one thing systematically. But if you start to collaborate, then maybe we can share that kind of responsibility. But definitely it's a job that requires a lot of time and a lot of effort. That's why it's so challenging and so aging.
So I think the question on most people's lips is what's next for Frida Escobedo? What projects are you looking for, and what will we see you doing next?
Well, we're trying to stay quite open-ended. We're doing everything from furniture design, hospitality, retail spaces, a private home, some mixed-use buildings. We're starting a few projects in the U.S., but we've also been participating in biennials in Europe, also in the U.S. I want to keep teaching. That's challenging because then I have to keep flying from Mexico to wherever I teach. and that takes hours from the office, so it's a hard balance. So maybe in the future I will be looking for a partner. That would be very healthy for me. But also like trying to keep the office small. We're trying to outsource as much as we can so we can focus on what we want to do, which is design and to ask questions and to keep experimenting.
Great, thank you. I think that's a good point for us to open up to the audience if anyone has any questions. Yeah, at the front.
Hi, sorry. Well, bienvenida, Frida, aquí a Toronto. My question is in regards of your design process, in specific, the retail space in New York, the Aesop. If you briefly can explain how you bring the brick inside the retail space?
Sure. Well, you will see in the pictures that it just looks like this pattern that we did on the wall. And every time we work with Aesop, we really enjoy the collaboration because they give us complete creative freedom. And if you see the stores that we've been developing with them, they're completely different from each other. So for this specific project in Park Slope, we were looking at the context, and there are these beautiful brick houses with very intricate facades. And that was like the first thing that we wanted to experiment with, like how can we create this conversation with the context. But then we started thinking, this was the moment when Donald Trump was elected. So we were like, how can we create something that asks a different question? So we developed, this is a side story that only people in the studio know. We started developing these bricks in Mexico that are like rammed earth. It's like compacted soil from Oaxaca, which is very red, and it gives it this like very particular like pink tone to it, which is very beautiful. But it was a way of like doing this tiny little, like joke of having Mexican territory in New York without them knowing. So it's actually like a Mexican store that's in the US. So this idea of just like blurring the boundary of what frontiers are. And also because we recognize that labor comes from Latin America. Like all the workers that were doing and developing this store in the construction site either came from Mexico or from further south. So there's no frontiers, actually. It was easier to communicate with them, and they really understood the idea of just creating this pattern because they said, like, I'm familiar with that. I was a mason in Mexico before I came here. So that's a story. It's not just like the beauty of the physical space, but also maybe what you can do on the side, no?
Hi, thank you for your speech, your lecture. I was wondering, there's one picture where it looks like a cinder block park, and there's two kids there. Do you lift up the cinder blocks, or is it like a puzzle of some sort that they can recreate the space?
Yes, this is the picture. Maybe we can hold it there for 1 second. Thank you so much. This was the first project that I did that I mentioned. That was the first public project that I was commissioned. It was a competition, and it's in this beautiful courtyard in a museum designed by Matthias Geritz. And as you can see, the museum has this beautiful stela, like yellow wall that goes all the way up. And it was quite a challenge to create the summer pavilion that had to be very flexible to accommodate different programs. And the idea was to just use one single element that could create a very specific pattern that could be reconfigured to accommodate different uses. So you see like these kind of lines that serve as a stage, almost like for people to sit and see a lecture. But at the same time, these pieces could be moved by the public. So you would see the programmed layer of the museum and also the spontaneous layer of people moving the space to their own needs. So that's why you see these two girls moving and creating their own playground. And it was creating like this scenario or this platform where the spontaneous layer was as important as the programmed one. So it was almost like materializing how people activate the space.
Hi. Oh, that was loud. Well, thank you for being here. And I guess my question is, knowing how different it is to practice architecture in Mexico compared to the US or Canada, where in Mexico you are kind of like, you have more freedom to go and talk to a maestro de obra or whatever, and you don't necessarily have to present certain set of drawings to a contractor who will then develop another set of drawings that will get stamped and then will go to another set of drawings. What do you think is the main difference for you in your practice whenever you build something like El Eco, where you can actually have, concrete blocks on a park where kids will run around and maybe just trip and break their head, when that wouldn't happen anywhere here in Canada or in the States? Like, how do you navigate between those two very different worlds of the Mexican culture and the more North American culture on what a public space and what construction and fabrication should be?
It's a very interesting question, and I promise you no kids were harmed in this project. No. Mexican kids are very responsible. No, it's really interesting because, of course, it's a learning experience. There's an opportunity, as you just mentioned, of doing these very experimental, very free structures. But at the same time, we lack a little bit of rigor and a little bit of order sometimes. No, it's hard to convince a client to go through all the processes of budgeting before starting the construction and testing materials and doing prototypes. Is like a no, that's an extra expense, and then they end up spending more money and blaming you. So there are opportunities and challenges in each one of the parts of the globe, and I think it's a matter of understanding what is a learning experience and what you should be able to navigate and try to escape. Like of course we've found challenges, especially with regulation, and I think standardization in that sense can become very dangerous because it creates like this sense of, I wouldn't say responsibility, but like this notion that public users in the public space are children, that cannot navigate space in a responsible way, and that's not necessarily true. It's more about fear than empathy, and I think that's difficult. But yes, we also have a lot to learn from other countries in terms of construction and design, of course.
Thank you, Frida, for sharing your thoughts. My question is regarding your design approach when it comes to sustainability, especially in the current environment where we're facing so many natural disasters, like in Australia right now. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think we should do less. And we were just discussing this, like we're trained to be producing more and more and more, and bigger is always better. That's what they tell us in architecture school, or at least that's what I was told. And I've seen a slow shift in thinking about like how can we plan more, how can we reuse more, how can we need less. And I think that's the biggest challenge, like the more we think in that way, in every aspect of our lives, not just in construction, but of course this is one of the most contaminating industries in the world. So I think we should change this idea that success is building more square meters. It's probably doing the opposite that's more successful now.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I saw you speak online. I think it was either through the Met or maybe the MoMA.
I'm sorry,
Sorry,
sorry.
I saw you speak online, and I think it was either through a forum through the Met or maybe the MoMA. And you were talking about the Serpentine Pavilion, and in the context of it being kind of an anti-rendering project, like this thing about not presenting this kind of perfect perspectival view. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and your relationship between representation of your work and the work and the body.
Sure. Yes, it's a great question. Thank you. Well, as you can see the images, if you see it from afar, the pavilion looks very boring, like it's just a box, And when I was being interviewed, journalists would come and say, like, what's the money shot for the Serpentine Pavilion? And I was like, what is a money shot? What does that mean? And they explained it to me, and I was like, well, that's probably more effective when you're designing an object, because, you know, like, this is the way that you relate to it. You understand it in its totality. But with architecture, that's never the case, in my opinion. Like, the experience of being immersed into architecture is a series of moments. It's the way our memory operates. We don't have, like, a full storyline. It's not continuous. It's a series of snapshots that then we montage in our brains, and that's how we remember things. And every time we remember something, it changes. So it's quite dynamic. And it's the same way as we experiment architecture. Every time you navigate through a space, it depends on the moment of the day and the light, but also with your emotions. Like, you won't experiment the same way you go into your house when you had a fight with your kids, or when you had a very happy day. So this idea of having just one single moment that could be interpreted by everyone in the same way was very difficult for me to understand. And there was an opportunity, because right now, with, you know, like, the emergence of social media, you would have a myriad of images just popping up on Instagram, like Serpentine Pavilion, and all of them were different. So we started doing this collection of different views. So we were, like, at the beginning, we were fighting against the idea of image, but then we reconciled with it through that way of thinking that maybe everyone has its own perspective and their own way of understanding and presenting it to their community. And there was this particular note on one of the Instagrammers that said, "This pavilion is bloody difficult to photograph." And I thought that was brilliant, because it was like, thank you. This is the best thing that you can say to me, that it's not able to be condensed into one single image.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Frida.
Thank you.